He wasn't supposed to speak, just to stand there, silent, still, a living part of the palace walls. But when Donald Trump pointed at him, smirked and said, "You work for me too. I'm the one who protects your king." What the royal guard replied next didn't just end the conversation. It ended the visit and left the entire grand corridor frozen in stunned silence. Now, before we show you what happened when King Charles stepped forward and restored centuries of order with just one sentence, make sure you're subscribed with the bell icon turned on and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, because this wasn't about politics. It was about who really holds the line when power forgets where it stands. The corridor breathed in silence, not the absence of sound, but the disciplined hush that wrapped itself around Buckingham Palace whenever ceremony was about to begin. Polished marble, gilded moulding, and a ceiling stretched so high it seemed to filter light from an older century. Everything spoke of heritage, of power too old to announce itself. Sergeant Alaric Denham stood motionless near the edge of the golden inlaid carpet that bisected the grand corridor. Left shoulder tilted slightly forward, bayonet rifle cradled against the seam of his uniform. He did not blink. He did not turn his head. He did not need to. To his left, footmen adjusted drapes. Ahead, floral arrangements were being realigned by a steward who knew better than to make a sound. And at the far end, beyond the arched entry to the blue drawing room, the ceremonial press cordon was already forming, photographers in regulation suits, their cameras silenced by velvet covers, preparing for the upcoming inspection. The air carried the faint scent of lavender polish and old wood. Denham's eyes remained fixed at parade angle, but his senses mapped the corridor with precision. The king's appearance was scheduled for 1400. The royal inspection would follow. Foreign dignitaries had been invited to witness the formality of royal structure, its choreography, its weight. Everything had been timed to the second. A bead of warmth crept beneath his collar, not sweat, just heat from bearing stillness under uniform. His right heel had not shifted in 71 minutes. His breathing was shallow, measured, steady. Then something changed. Not loud, just out of sequence. The sound of approaching engines in the courtyard, louder than royal protocol allowed. The crunch of tires on gravel, a door slam, then another. Not the synchronized rhythm of palace vehicles, something heavier. American by the sound of it. Denham didn't move, but internally he adjusted. His mind aligned the change. That motorcade hadn't been scheduled for another 9 minutes. Too early. Not cleared. A discreet cough came from the steward across the hall, not a sound of discomfort, a signal. Denham's peripheral vision confirmed it. The man had paused mid-adjustment, eyes toward the entryway. He heard the approach next. Shoes heavier than typical court protocol. And then a voice, too loud for the corridor. "Now this is something. Always wanted to see what the Queen kept back here." American accent, recognizable cadence. The footman froze. One even glanced. A subtle mistake, but forgivable given who had just walked in. Denham did not move. From the corner of his eye, he saw them emerge, Donald Trump, flanked by aides and personal security, strolling through the corridor as though it were a ballroom at one of his hotels. He was ahead of schedule, ahead of escort, and walking directly into restricted ceremonial space. Denham held his ground. He was not there to react. He was there to protect a boundary. And someone had just crossed it. Trump didn't pause at the threshold. The palace footmen had stiffened as he entered, not because they didn't recognize him, but because he came through the wrong entrance, unsignaled and 10 minutes early. Royal logistics run on seconds. Protocol is choreography. And the American entourage had just walked in like a marching band on the wrong beat. Trump's shoes echoed louder than they should have across the polished corridor. He waved at no one in particular, gesturing up at the ornate ceiling. "Now this is something. Buckingham's always been my second favourite, after the White House, of course." No one replied. They weren't meant to. The palace wasn't a campaign stage. It was theatre where silence spoke first. Denham didn't shift. But behind his stoicism, his instincts mapped the breach. Trump's aides, two men in suits, one woman with a clipboard, and a palace attaché trailing awkwardly behind, struggled to keep pace. They whispered to each other about lighting and angle of entry. One of them fumbled with his phone, trying to confirm if the press pool was already in position. Then Trump saw him. The guard, a tall, stone-like figure stationed exactly where the golden runner met the southern arch of the grand corridor. Scarlet coat, white strap across his chest, tall black bearskin hat, casting a soft shadow over unmoving eyes. Rifle aligned, boots angled perfectly to regulation. Trump slowed. He always noticed uniforms. They drew him in, not for what they symbolized, but for how still they were. Power without movement. He stepped toward Denham. His entourage hesitated, unsure if they were supposed to follow. "Look at this guy," Trump said to no one, standing there like a wax figure. "They say these ones don't flinch." A few aides smiled, not out of amusement, but reflex. One of them checked the time nervously. Trump leaned in, hands clasped behind his back. "You know, I've hired security taller than you," he chuckled. "Bet they don't let you blink in there." Still no movement. It was a test. He stepped closer, past the invisible threshold dignitaries weren't meant to cross without escort. The moment his polished shoe touched the edge of the golden carpet, a murmur went through the press pool behind them. Denham noticed. The king's ceremonial boundary had been breached. Trump's voice dropped an octave, louder, more performative. "You work for me too," he said with a crooked smile. "I'm the one who protects your king." The air stilled. It wasn't a shout. It didn't need to be. The words were disrespect, not in volume, but in assumption. The idea that the guard's loyalty could be claimed like a contract. Reporters glanced up from their lenses. Palace staff went rigid. A footman dropped a polished brass clipboard. Denham's head turned, only slightly, only enough to look Trump directly in the eyes. He didn't blink. He didn't smirk. He didn't move his rifle. But something was coming, and the entire corridor knew it. Sergeant Alaric Denham did not speak. Not yet, not without cause. But deep behind his stillness, something shifted, not in emotion, but in readiness. He had stood through rainstorms in full dress. He had held post during state funerals. He had watched dignitaries attempt jokes, try selfies, even pretend to bark at him once. None of that moved him. Discipline wasn't about reaction. It was about remembrance. But this moment was different. "You work for me too." The sentence hadn't been shouted, but it echoed nonetheless, louder than it should have, heavier than it had any right to be inside the sovereign walls of Buckingham Palace. Denham's jaw tightened, so slightly it wouldn't register on a camera. His fingers remained relaxed against the rifle's stock, his stance unbroken. But internally his mind was already assessing the breach. The man before him wasn't just stepping over protocol, he was attempting to claim the guard, reduce the role to a gesture, a spectacle, something owned. Denham recalled the briefing of recommitment, the oath every ceremonial guard renewed annually, signed beneath the royal seal. Service by silence, protection without exception, loyalty to the sovereign, not the spectacle. He had signed that oath 15 times as Nalin. The golden inlay line Trump had stepped over wasn't paint. It marked the outer limit of ceremonial jurisdiction, a historic boundary never crossed by a foreign leader without invitation. It was designed to protect not the room, but what the room represented. And Trump had crossed it like it was velvet rope in a hotel lobby. Denham's thoughts didn't race. They lined up, clean, orderly, as though trained. Is this a moment of symbolic threat? Yes. Is there physical danger? No. Is correction justified by regulation? Yes. If violation continues. Is verbal response permitted? Not by default. Only if authority is threatened. He exhaled through his nose. Slow, silent, steady. Trump was still standing in front of him, still smiling, waiting for a smirk, a blink. Any concession that he'd gotten under the guard's skin. But Denham wasn't made of wax, and he wasn't ornamental. He was Coldstream, 25 years service, Afghanistan veteran, Sandhurst certified, decorated for field command. He had stood in silence at the Queen's side during the final trooping of the colour, rifle drawn, jaw locked, while she said nothing but her presence filled the entire parade square. Now she was gone, but the guard remained, and that meant her standards remained. Trump's polished shoe had shifted forward again, barely an inch, but closer. Another inch, and he'd be standing on the inner ceremonial axis, a place only occupied by royal blood, chaplains, and military escorts. That line, invisible to most, lived in Denham's bones. One more step, and the decision wouldn't be internal anymore. It would be spoken. Trump grinned, taking another casual step forward, right over the inner ceremonial axis, a line he didn't know existed, but one that every guard memorized like scripture. "You work for me, too," he said again, now slower, as if repeating it louder might make it truer. "I'm the one who protects your king." The flash from a nearby press camera lit the corridor white for a moment. No one spoke. The words hung heavy in the gilded air, not just arrogant, but presumptive. A foreign leader, uninvited, claiming allegiance from a soldier who had pledged his life to the crown. Denham's head lifted, slow, precise, and silent. His eyes, veiled behind years of stillness, locked onto Trump's. For the briefest beat, no one moved. Then came the reply. Not loud, not rehearsed, just clear. "No, sir," Denham said, his voice even as stone. "We protect the crown from whoever forgets what respect means." There was no anger, no threat. But the words struck like a bell rung too close to the ear. Trump blinked. The grin faltered. The camera shutters exploded. Photographers who'd been instructed to stay silent could no longer help themselves. They'd just witnessed something rare. A ceremonial figure, unmoving and mute by default, breaking silence with words that carried centuries behind them. One of Trump's aides stepped forward urgently, whispering something in his ear. Another placed a nervous hand on his shoulder. But Trump didn't move, not yet. He looked the guard up and down. For a moment there was something new in his expression. Not confusion, not offence. Something closer to disbelief. Because Denham hadn't flinched, hadn't leaned back, hadn't backed down. This wasn't a man swayed by authority. This was a man backed by history. Trump's voice dropped again. "You think you can speak to me like that?" Denham remained silent. Trump pointed, fingertip nearly brushing the edge of the white strap crossing Denham's chest. "That badge says you serve the king. Well, I've sat with him. I've been in more rooms than you ever will." Still nothing. Then Denham spoke again, not as confrontation, but as correction. "And in those rooms, sir, you were a guest. This corridor is not yours to command." A murmur rippled down the hallway. Diplomats, aides, and officials pretending not to listen, now openly watching. For a second, it looked like Trump might say more. His lips parted. His brow twitched. But the silence was growing louder. The press pool had gone still, not out of fear, but reverence. Something bigger than politics had just happened. Then footsteps, measured, soft, yet unmistakably in charge. The rhythm of polished Oxfords over stone. From the far arch, the silhouette of King Charles III emerged, walking alone without fanfare, eyes already fixed on the confrontation ahead. The standoff was no longer theoretical. Now it had an audience. And the authority that truly mattered had entered the room. The moment King Charles appeared, the corridor realigned. Guards at distant posts straightened their stance. Aides froze mid-step. Even the press pool, trained to capture chaos, instinctively lowered their cameras. The authority that Denham had silently embodied now had a voice, a crown, and a face. The king did not rush. He walked with quiet intent, his expression unreadable, neither alarmed nor amused. His eyes moved from Denham to Trump and back again, taking in the distance between them, the crossed boundary and the still ticking tension. Trump took half a step back, then caught himself. "Your Majesty," he said, forcing a diplomatic smile, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding with your man here. He decided to play tough." Charles stopped 2 paces from the golden carpet line. He didn't look at Denham, not yet. Instead, his gaze settled on Trump's shoes, both of which now rested directly inside the ceremonial axis. "You crossed the sovereign line," the king said softly. Trump blinked. "What line? I'm here early. I thought I'd take a look." Charles didn't reply. He turned slightly to the palace chamberlain, who had followed silently behind. "Was the cordon removed?" Charles asked. "No, sir," Charles nodded once. "Then the boundary stood." Trump's grin faltered again. Behind them, an American aide touched their earpiece and looked toward the press gallery. A camera's lens was still aimed, uncertain whether to risk another flash. Charles finally turned to Denham. "Sergeant?" Denham's voice was crisp, low, and steady. "Visitor advanced beyond ceremonial perimeter without clearance. I issued verbal instruction to halt." A pause. "Visitor refused." Charles looked at Trump again. "Did you refuse?" Trump hesitated. "I didn't think it was a big deal. He took it a bit personally, I think." Charles's gaze hardened, not with anger, but with centuries behind it. "These guards do not take things personally," he said. "They take things seriously." The sentence was quiet, but it landed like a gavel. Trump shifted. "Look, I was making a point. He said something about protecting the crown from whoever forgets what respect means." Charles finished it for him. Silence. Trump glanced around. His aides were still. The press had gone fully quiet now, not a single click, only breathing, and the faint rustle of a distant curtain moving under breeze. And then Charles added with finality, "Let him pass." It wasn't permission. It was dismissal. Trump's mouth opened, then closed. The line had been drawn, not by the guard, not by the carpet, but by the monarch himself. He took a step back, another. His body moved through the corridor, but his posture told the real story. Shoulders slightly dropped, steps no longer claiming space. He didn't look at Denham again, because he didn't need to. The guard had not raised his voice, had not moved his weapon, had not issued threat. But the crown had spoken, and that was enough. For a few seconds after Trump stepped back, the entire corridor remained suspended in ceremonial pause. Not a single aide moved. No one adjusted their clipboard. No one whispered into their lapel mic. Even the press, conditioned to chase disruption like hounds after blood, seemed unsure whether to lower their lenses or keep them raised, in fear of missing what silence might say next. King Charles didn't fill the air with commands. He didn't speak of consequences. He simply remained still, regarding his guard the same way a sculptor might look at a monument, not in critique, but recognition. Then, finally, the king stepped toward the very line Trump had crossed, that thin golden inlay in the marble that most visitors never noticed and that no member of Foreign Office had dared to cross in decades. He gestured slightly toward the ground. "This," he said, "was placed here not as decoration, but to mark the space between ceremony and authority. No one passes it until the crown does." The words weren't spoken for Trump's benefit. They were for the room, for the record. He turned back to Denham. "Sergeant, state your station." Denham's voice came evenly, without force. "Grenadier post, ceremonial corridor axis. Standing watch for His Majesty's entry." Charles nodded once. "And was it challenged?" "Yes, sir." "By whom?" "Visitor unknown to post, later identified by demeanour." The line was deliberate. No titles, no personal attack, just professional observation, and that made it worse. Trump had just been demoted, not in position, but in protocol. Denham had referred to him not as a leader, but as a disturbance. Charles turned to his chamberlain. "Has the incident been recorded?" The chamberlain, a trim man in grey gloves and a crisp royal ledger in hand, replied, "It has now, sir." Trump's mouth twitched. "This is what we're doing now? Writing people up over a carpet line?" Charles looked at him, not in confrontation, but with the weariness of someone who had spent decades waiting for certain men to learn the difference between spectacle and service. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look around for approval. He simply said, "Some lines are not seen until they are crossed, and some uniforms do not speak until silence becomes cowardice." The sentence landed not as a rebuke, but as a boundary, the true kind, the kind etched into tradition. Trump's expression faltered again. His eyes flicked toward the guard, perhaps hoping, absurdly, for a reaction. But Denham had already returned to his stillness. He was no longer an individual in that moment. He was what he had always been trained to be, a presence that guarded dignity, not just doors. Charles stepped back from the line, turned, resumed the inspection. That was all. No ceremony, no lecture, just a return to order, because order itself had already spoken. And the one who had claimed control had been corrected by a man who didn't even move. The king stepped aside, allowing the corridor's rhythm to restart, but it didn't move at full pace, not yet. There was a weight in the air that hadn't lifted. Trump said nothing more. He adjusted his cuff, muttered something inaudible to his aide, and walked past the guard without looking back. Each step echoed more than it should have. His entourage followed in silence, no press briefing, no final quip. Just the long walk of a man who had underestimated a wall disguised as a person. Behind him, the palace chamberlain carefully recorded the incident into the royal incident ledger, a thick, leather-bound volume never seen by the public, never scanned, never archived digitally, only ink, only parchment. He paused before writing the quote. "What exactly was said?" he asked, looking to Denham. Denham didn't blink. "Verbatim." "Yes." He repeated it, word for word. "No, sir. We protect the crown from whoever forgets what respect means." The chamberlain nodded and began writing, slowly, deliberately, as if to ensure the words were pressed deep enough to last another 100 years. Elsewhere, the press remained eerily still. No one shouted questions. No one demanded access. They'd caught the quote, and that would be enough. The headline had already written itself, not in tabloids, but in silence. King Charles turned once more to Denham, his voice just above a whisper. "There are moments," he said, "where a single sentence can hold the line for everything." He didn't wait for agreement. He walked. The senior aide to the king, watching closely from a nearby arch, stepped forward as the inspection formally resumed. He stopped beside Denham, close enough that their uniforms nearly brushed. "His Majesty saw everything," he said quietly. "You held your station." Then he stepped back. No smile, no nod, just recognition. The kind that men like Denham carried in silence and never needed framed. Down the corridor, the inspection continued. Diplomatic small talk resumed, but the volume never returned to normal. The incident, brief as it had been, lingered in every eye, every step, every breath. And back at the golden inlay, Sergeant Denham remained at his post, unmoved. The procession resumed as if nothing had happened, but everyone knew better. The diplomatic inspection proceeded through the adjacent reception wing, with soft-spoken officials leading guests through the Queen's Gallery and the Marble Hall. The press returned to their prescribed posts. A few dared take photos again, though none turned their lens back toward the grand corridor, because something sacred had just occurred there, and no one wanted to be the one who cheapened it. Sergeant Denham remained at his post, unshaken. His face, once again, was a mask of ceremonial calm, but beneath it, his duty had evolved. He was no longer guarding just a corridor. He was guarding what it represented, the idea that service outranks status. A quiet footstep approached from the side corridor. It was Lord Merryweather, private secretary to the king, a man known for his precision and brevity. He did not smile, did not make eye contact. He simply passed close enough to Denham to speak without being heard by others. "His Majesty said 2 words before entering the council chamber," he murmured. Denham didn't respond. He wasn't supposed to. Lord Merryweather continued anyway. He said, "Well held, that's all." Then he disappeared down the hallway, coat brushing faintly against the marble as he turned the corner. Denham exhaled just once. No movement, no pride, just air. Across the palace, behind closed doors, quiet reports were already being drafted. The American delegation would receive an edited version of the corridor incident. Words like misunderstanding and ceremonial clarification would be used. The footage would be archived, not deleted, but not distributed. It would live in official vaults, part of the private royal record. But the moment, the real moment, didn't belong to the archives. It belonged to the silence that followed it, a silence that would travel further than any press release. At 15:40, the afternoon bell rang through the palace, the signal to rotate post. Denham did not move until precisely the second it was due. His replacement approached from the west wing. A silent nod exchanged. The transfer of duty, the resumption of tradition. And as Denham turned to march off, boots crisp against the stone, the golden line behind him glinted under the high skylight, a thread of history that hadn't been trampled, only tested, and quietly defended. Dawn crept slowly across the Buckingham courtyard, the sky a pale wash of grey and pearl. A faint mist hung over the eastern gardens, curling low around the hedgerows, untouched by footfall. Inside the palace, most corridors remained dim and hushed, the kind of early silence only staff and sentries shared. But by the main archway, already in place, stood Sergeant Alaric Denham. Same uniform, same stance. Rifle positioned precisely at shoulder rest. The tall ceremonial bearskin casting its shadow over a face carved by restraint. The world outside had already moved on, or tried to. Overnight, the incident had found its way into diplomatic briefings, unofficial transcripts, even a few cautious whispers in embassies. But no headlines, not yet. It didn't need them. The story was already moving, not in tabloids, but in quiet reverence. Among palace footmen who had seen too much to speak, among guards in other wings who straightened a little taller that morning, and among aides who, for the first time, paused before stepping across the golden carpet line. And now, on this new day, Denham stood again, not because he had to, but because the post was his. A rustle came from across the courtyard, a small BBC camera crew setting up for a scheduled segment on the upcoming state banquet. The junior producer gestured lazily toward Denham, clearly unaware of yesterday's scene. The cameraman panned right, framing the guard as a visual insert. "Hold it there, good symmetry. Just keep the statue-like guy in frame." The image that broadcast live across Britain a few minutes later, and then quietly, virally across the world, was simple. A lone royal guard, unblinking, standing at full post. The rising morning behind him, and nothing but stillness in his expression. No one needed a caption. Inside the palace, through the window pane just above the corridor stairs, a figure passed, briefly. A coat collar turned up, a silhouette too tall to be a butler, a pace too steady to be hurried. King Charles. He didn't stop, didn't acknowledge, but he walked past the window just as the camera framed the guard. And, just for a second, the reflection caught them both in a single pane of glass. The man who wore the crown, and the man who had protected what it meant. The camera crew moved on. The light shifted. The wind nudged a flag overhead, and Denham didn't move because he didn't need to. Would you have spoken if someone tried to claim your silence? Was the guard's reply enough? Or should the king have said more? And do you believe tradition should ever bow to ego? Tell us what you think in the comments. We read every single one. If this moment moved you, tap that like button, subscribe with the bell icon turned on, and share this video with someone who still believes respect is earned, not declared. Other Royal Guard stories are now on your screen. Click one to keep watching, and we'll see you tomorrow. Same time, same place.